Hi everyone, my name is Andrew Coffey. I'm 20 years old. I am from Buffalo and I currently attend UB where I study civil engineering. And for my research project, I decided to look into the declining construction and manufacturing. To really understand this whole concept, you have to look back into the pre-1900s era, into the Industrial Revolution age, which is really when construction and manufacturing really started to get going. This is when companies could really mass produce things and ship them across the country, and also when a lot of cities started to get built thanks to the revolution in steel industry. And if you fast forward a little bit to the post-World War II area, this is when construction really started to get going, because this is when all the soldiers from World War II came home and they wanted to start families, they wanted to have a house, and they wanted a car, which led to the boom in the automotive industry. And if you fast forward a little bit more into the 1970s to the 1990s, this is when we really start to see the decline in quality in construction and manufacturing, mostly due to economic reasons. Prices went through the roof in that time, and that's when companies really started cutting corners in their quality to try and save some money. And it's been kind of the same story ever since. I'm sure all of you guys at some point have heard somebody say, oh, they don't make them like they used to, which is unfortunately true. I'm going to start with the decline in construction first. I'm mainly going to be using houses and apartment buildings in my example here. And the reasons for the decline in construction is the cost of materials, cheap sources of labor, tight time restraints, and the idea of profit versus customer satisfaction. So in terms of materials, a lot of residential buildings, especially houses and apartment complexes, are made almost entirely out of lumber now. There's very little steel involved, just from the surrounding area, from what I've seen in apartments and other things going up, it's almost entirely lumber. There's only a few steel beams that go in on the foundation, and it honestly really isn't enough. This leads to a lot of problems down the road, such as foundation issues. The building will creak in the wind and it will settle weird. That can lead to all sorts of issues. Then the next issue is the cheaper sources of labor. These companies, they want to maximize all their profits, so they're going to find the cheapest source of labor possible, which leads to people not being really as qualified, but they'll do the job for less. And then another one of the real big reasons is time restraints. And if we talk about the housing market here, a lot of these new residential neighborhoods that are going up, the land developer will have a time frame of 3 to 5 years, give or take, and in that time frame they'll have to put up 300 to 400 houses. And if you were the land developer there, you kind of think, well, I have to get the cheapest materials possible to turn the most profit, and I have to put these houses up as quickly as possible, which leaves them being kind of cheaply made. They cut a lot of corners, so the houses will just barely pass their year-end inspection. And then once the homeowners have their house for a couple years, they might encounter a lot of problems like foundation issues, and their houses will creak in the slightest wind. And it's mostly due to the idea of company profit versus customer satisfaction. The company wants to get as much money as they can, and they'll cut corners to do so at the expense of the satisfaction of their customer, because to them it's really just another customer. A lot of these big companies, they could really care less. If you go to Walmart and you buy something like a bicycle, for example, and it breaks, they're not really going to care, because they have so many other people buying bikes that aren't going to say anything. And that, I'll let that segue into the discussion about the decline in manufacturing. And the reason for this is obviously economic reasons, and then material substitutes such as plastics, the idea of quality versus quantity, and again the idea of company profit versus customer satisfaction. We'll get the economic reasons out of the way first. I'm sure you guys see in all the news and everything, companies want to move overseas because it's cheaper to operate and there's less environmental restrictions. Another idea is the idea of quality versus quantity, and that will lead into the material substitute, which I previously talked about, like the lumber instead of steel, and here I'll talk about plastics. So I'll use the automotive world as an example, and I'll talk about the the company General Motors, because they are kind of notorious for this, of using a lot of cheap plastics in the interior of their cars, which over time, I'm sure you guys have seen videos online of people like pressing like the plastics on their dashboard and it'll like creak and crack. You know, a lot of the older Dodge Rams trucks had a lot of issues where the plastic dashboard, if it got too hot in the sun, it would literally like crack and you could like rip parts of it right off, you know. And that's the idea of quality versus quantity, like these big automotive companies like Fiat Chrysler and General Motors, they make a lot of cars. General Motors has made the most cars and sold the most cars in America for years now, and they were just recently overtaken by Toyota. So they cut a lot of corners in their interior quality so they can churn out a lot more cars for less money, but still sell them at a fairly high price. And that's the whole idea of profit versus customer satisfaction. They're willing to use these cheaper materials in their interiors because they're selling so many cars. It really doesn't matter to them in the long run. A lot of people lease their cars now, so their cars really aren't getting old. By the time the lease is up, they really don't have too many issues, and the company doesn't really care. And then leading into today, it's still, the quality of construction manufacturing is still going down, mostly because a lot of these larger companies favor having profit over customer satisfaction. A lot of the smaller companies that do have really good customer satisfaction make a great product. They can't make it as cheap as the other large companies who can afford to make them cheaper and a lot more of them. If you go to like your local hardware store and you want to buy some lumber, it's obviously going to be more expensive if you go to like Home Depot or Lowe's, which have massive quantities of lumber, and it can be a little bit poor quality too. But unfortunately, people these days are looking for the lowest possible price, which in turn leads to really the lowest quality.